The day was nearing its end when Alice finally found another living thing, but it was not exactly what she had been expecting. She had just climbed over a large chunk of wall when she saw him. A large, scruffy black cat was sitting on a stone in the center of a blasted garden. Blood leaked from a nick on his ear, and his eyes were the strange orange-green unique to cats. Ah, Alice sighed, relief clear on her face. I'm so glad to see you, Mr. Cat. I'd begun to think I was all alone out here, but at least you're here. Maybe that means that other people are too. The cat stared at her with eyes that couldn't be described as anything other than unimpressed. Alice, however, knew better. She had spent much of her time in the garden feeding cats, much to her uncle's chagrin, and she privately compared the nobles to a bunch of cats, so she could tell by the way his tail swished that he was relieved to see her. She slowly approached the black Tom, not wanting to startle him. Here, kitty, she called out. He seemed to consider her for a moment, then gave a disdainful sniff before leaping lightly off his stone and toward her. Good kitty, she crooned, stroking his ruffled fur soothingly. Where's your family? She mumbled under her breath. The cat seemed to understand her question and made a soft, grating mew. Sad, she thought, very sad. Don't worry, Mr. Cat, she said, smiling at him happily. At least we have each other. I suppose that's something. Alice froze. She turned to look down at the black cat again. His eyes were amused now, that was clear. The voice that had just spoken seemed to be his, save the fact that, cats don't talk. Alice laughed nervously, or hysterically. It was a weak sound. Steeling herself against her own fragility, she mentally prepared herself for embarrassment. The most logical option, she knew, was that someone was playing a sick joke on her, but something in her told her that wasn't the case. That was you, wasn't it, Cat? His lips pulled back into what could only be a smirk, but his eyes were surprised. You're handling this well, the cat informed her. Her head fell into her shaking hands. If only this were a dream, she sighed wistfully. It would be such a strange and awful dream, but it would be so very interesting. Perhaps I would remember it when I woke up, and I would tell my aunt and uncle about it. They would laugh, and Uncle would tell me to write it down so that I could look back on it later. Maybe then, after breakfast, I would go to write it, recalling the fire and the noise, the strange shadow dream within the dream of red eyes and black figures, waking up to the pain in my skin and the sorrow in my heart, calling endlessly for people who never answered, and finally ending with meeting a talking black cat named... She broke off for a moment, looking blankly into the cat's eyes. You do have a name, don't you? The cat nodded. Mordu. So that was an excerpt from my book, which is entitled Alice. It started as a hypothetical situation where I imagined what would happen if my class were in a wartime situation, actually. Originally, my friends and I fought valiantly against the invaders, making our way to my friend Sienna's house in Ukiah to live the rest of our lives. I wrote several drafts of that plot, but... Hold on, shoot. Okay, I'm just continuing. I wrote several drafts following that plot, but since then my story has changed a lot. So when my senior project came around, I knew I wanted to do it writing this story because I have always loved books and I've always known that I wanted to be an author, and I love this story so much. So I had some strategies going into this. For a while, a couple months actually, I wrote 500 words a day of the story. I wrote character sheets, very basic things, like names, favorite colors, where they grew up, what they liked most. I made sure to write even when I wasn't feeling inspired, which is very important, perseverance. I drew the world. I also drew the characters. That way I would have a better understanding of the setting and what it looked like. So for a senior project, it's suggested that you have a mentor, and mine was named Steve Foley. He is an author himself of several books, and he suggested that I create an emotional arc for the characters to show their development through the book. He also suggested that I write in-depth biographies, and I got a little into that. I was more into the in-depth emotional arc. I wrote biographies that weren't quite as in-depth as he suggested. But more than anything, talking with him deeply inspired me to the point where I completely changed the plot of my book. No longer was Alice set in the modern world, in modern time. It was set in the far-flung future after our world had already endured a nuclear war. For the summary of this new book, our world is enduring its second apocalypse, and the girl who was chosen to lead a group of survivors is the main character. Battling starvation and dehydration, Alice and her unlikely companion must work together to keep their group alive. But can they overcome the deep-rooted prejudices of the caste system they've spent their entire lives in? So, I wrote 50 pages of this new plot, and it flowed. All these 50 pages were between my two main characters, Alice and Mor'du. It was going extremely well. I was happy, I was writing, I was feeling accomplished, and then disaster struck. I got writer's block. This was extremely surprising for me. I didn't understand how I could get writer's block because I created the story. I knew everything about it. How could that possibly happen? It's also extremely frustrating to get writer's block because you've told all these people you're writing a book and now they're kind of like, hey, how's the book going? And you're like, it's fine, don't ask any more questions. And you get a little defensive around it too, clearly. More than anything, I was confused. Like I said, I came up with this book. I came up with these characters. How on earth could I not know them well enough to write them? Well, sometime in January, I was sitting in senior project class, and Beth was asking us yet again what our question was for our senior project. And the idea was that we'd have some central question that would tie it all together and that we could focus on, and it would be wonderful. Now, up until this point, I had not had a question. I didn't see the need for one. I knew what I was doing. I didn't have any questions. But as I was sitting in this class, I realized I do have a question. And at the same time, I understood why I was having such a problem writing. I realized that I did not know my characters. At some point down the line, I had disassociated them from human beings somehow. They were no longer human, they were characters. So they didn't react to situations like humans would. Like, for instance, I am a very conflict-avoidant person. I am working on it, it's something I'm aware of, but unknowingly, I transferred this onto my characters so that there were no arguments. And if you're living in a post-apocalyptic world with tensions running high, there are going to be arguments. There's going to be conflict. There's going to be, growth through conflict, which was a key developmental phase they were missing. And so I knew my question. How do I accurately portray a human being? How do I make one? So, to answer this question, I started doing what my mentor had recommended all those months ago when he told me that I should write extremely in-depth character biographies. I made it so that they weren't conflict avoidant anymore. I started mapping out, like who dislikes who has issues with what beliefs. And I also had to answer a very key question of nature versus nurture. Since I am essentially creating these humans from scratch, I need to have an opinion on that because otherwise they're not realistic. So I decided my take on nature versus nurture is that it's both. Nature, there's some things in you that would be hardwired in you even if you weren't raised the way you were. Like, take Alice, for example. She's extremely honorable. It is a core central value to her. She was raised to be honorable because she was raised as a noble, but even if she wasn't raised that way, she still would have been honorable. So, as I look back on this process of writing a book, the most important thing I think I've learned is don't give up, because things can come to you. If you give up, you're closing all the doors that you'll ever fix the situation. If I'd given up on this book, I'd be miserable, I'd be upset, and I wouldn't like myself very much. I'm going to finish this book. It's my life's work, and every day new things dawn on me. Heck, just Friday, I suddenly realized how I wanted to open the book. I mean, how I wanted to start it, which is something up until now I've been struggling with. So, you just have to keep going. Even if you aren't pleased with where you are, even if you're not happy with what you're writing, you can't give up because you never know when things will change. Thank you.